Lost Private. We're in Normandy.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 33 of the We're Not Lost Private podcast. And I'm pleased to welcome a repeat offender slash guest, Mr. Adam Berry. Those of you who have been following along with the podcast have probably seen our previous episode with Adam when he came on to talk about the 82nd Airborne and some troop carrier stuff. We were great. It was great having him on. He's obviously a master of his information and he knows his stuff. And just a reminder to all of our listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in. You can find us on Patreon. If you'd like to become a Patreon subscriber for $3 a month, it gets you full access to all of our episodes, behind the scenes work, newsletters, photos, paperwork, all related to our episodes. $3 a month, not really a big amount of money, and it helps us keep the program running. You can also find us on YouTube and Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, etc. Pretty much any podcast catcher you use. Adam, welcome.
Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, and this show was kind of a surprise. It didn't really, I didn't have any forethought to this. We had just been chatting. I'll give everybody a quick background. I'm doing some research for a future episode on La Jourier and the D-Day and June 7th fighting there with the 2nd Battalion of the 501st. And I had been tripping along on on a message forum board, an old one, and spotted some exchanges between Adam and a few other folks, including 101st Airborne historian Mark Bando. And I just sent him a note about a piece of information that I thought he might be able to help out with. And it really didn't work out that way. But the good thing was it segued into a nice conversation about maybe coming on again. And you had a topic basically at the tips of your fingers, which I thought was great.
I've always got topics at the tips of my fingers, thankfully. So yeah, hopefully the any viewers / listeners find this one to be interesting.
I think they will. I mean, when you think about it, the story of brothers in combat has been engaging throughout all of the World War II history community. You saw it with Saving Private Ryan, which is based on the Nyland brothers, the Sullivan brothers. Just recently, part of that research I've been doing, there's a story that I read from Jack Schaffer, who was a rifleman in first platoon of F Company 501. One of his fellow platoon mates was killed during the shelling by the USS Quincy, and Jack happened to be evacuated back towards Utah Beach. And a soldier came up to him on the beach, had spotted his 101st Airborne patch, and basically inquired if he knew about his brother. And his brother just so happened, Jack had seen him killed by the shelling from the Quincy. So I think the topic of brothers in combat, especially never seeing each other again, is something that's always piqued everybody's curiosity within the World War II history community. And when you pitched your topic, I thought it was just perfect for this. So I don't want to hold up the story any longer. I'll turn it over to you.
No, not at all. I mean, the story is very similar in it's sort of tragically coincidental, similar to the story you just told about the guy at Utah and the guy's brother being killed by the Quincy fire. It's the story of these two particular brothers has always been fascinating to me because on one side you've got a guy who served with the 82nd, which is one love of mine, and then on the other side you've got his brother who was 2 years younger than him, who served with the 61st Troop Carrier Group. So they're in the same field of career work, if you want to call it that. They're involved in airborne operations, but they're very much in different units. But they're two units that obviously, as I say, are pretty close to my heart in terms of what I do research wise. So the whole story has always been very fascinating. And there's a side to the story that I have no doubt that many people that are listening will have heard about. And then there's the other side of the story, which most people probably haven't heard about and won't have, and even if they'd seen the name, might not have put two and two together and come to the conclusion that these guys were brothers. So the story is actually of two brothers from a Hitztaler family. There were four brothers in total and a sister. But in particular, we're going to be looking at Anthony Hitztaler, who was a member of the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment, and his brother William, who was a rated power pilot, so a first lieutenant in the 61st Troop Carrier Group, which was one of, at the time, in the early stages of their war anyway, one of four groups that was assigned to the 52nd Troop Carrier Wing. So William, as a rated first pilot, had deployed paratroopers of 82nd Airborne Division over Sicily, over Italy, and then obviously in February 1944, transferred with the 61st Troop Carrier Group over to RAF Barkston Heath, which thankfully for me is about a 50-odd minute drive, so it's a local location for me. Anthony, on the other hand, went down the other route of opting to jump out of aircraft as opposed to flying them, and join the airborne. And he went through his basic training and went through his airborne training and was eventually assigned to the headquarters company, 1st Battalion of the 507th, and obviously went through all of their stateside training, and then at the end of 1943 transferred overseas to Northern Ireland, to Port Stanley, I think it is Port Stanley. If I always get Port Stewart and Port Stanley mixed up because both of those locations in Northern Ireland were used by the 82nd in the build up to them moving to England. But I think it was Port Stanley. And if there's any sort of big golf fans listening, as far as I'm aware, the Open is going to be at Port Stanley in Northern Ireland. So as you're watching that golf on the TV, the golf course is pretty much where the campsite was during the war. So there's a little bit of history there. I mean, obviously the 507th, along with the 508th as part of the 2nd Airborne Brigade, were attached to the 82nd Airborne Division, and they were moved over to England. And the 507th, so Anthony's regiment, was camped in the grounds of a building called Tollerton Hall in Nottinghamshire. And what's amazing is that Tollerton Hall is about 25 miles as the crow flies from RAF Barkston Heath. So the two brothers find themselves very, very close together all of a sudden, having been separated for quite some time. So as I say, going back slightly to the period that Anthony would have been training stateside with the 507th, William was already overseas with the 61st, deploying the 82nd over Sicily and over Italy. And he was a very, very experienced pilot with 14th Troop Carrier Squadron, 61st Troop Carrier Group. So all of a sudden, by chance, they find themselves essentially on each other's doorsteps here in England. And it gives them an opportunity through communication to realise, oh, hold on a minute, we're pretty close to one another. And of course, it allows them to meet up when they're in the UK and to enjoy what time they can have together. And of course, I have no doubt that Anthony would have been picking William's brains as to, what the airborne missions that preceded that period were like and how successful they were and all of that side of things.
And yet he's the older brother, and the younger brother is the one with the combat experience. That must have been an interesting family dynamic, maybe over beers at a pub.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Obviously, we only really can use our imagination as to the sort of things they would have been talking about. But I would imagine there would have been a small element of ribbing that Anthony hadn't yet seen any enemy action, and as you well know, Joe, the troop carrier forces suffered at the hands of some friendly fire incidents over Sicily. German anti-aircraft fire was pretty intense over Italy, so William could well claim that he'd been on the receiving end of the Germans long before Anthony got the chance.
Is there any evidence from the family that they communicated? Are there letters between the two of them, or just
Uh,
correspondence between the family?
I was provided an oral history from William by Martin Morgan, but it's very vague.
Hmm.
I get the impression that there's an element of, from William's perspective, almost kind of shutting out, which we obviously will get to, the loss of his brother. Um, he also, his memory was also very vague about what unit his brother was with,
Hmm. Interesting.
which I'll come to. But the only time that William actually mentions in his oral history that the two met was in the week running up to D-Day.
Hmm.
And originally I took that as, almost, it's something that I'm often telling people not to do when it comes to sort of taking. You'll know as well as anyone, sometimes you have to take oral histories with a pinch of salt. Sometimes they're not always 100% how things were. People people's memories fade. They remember things differently. And but when we did volume one of our troop carrier book, which featured William's troop carrier group, we mentioned about the fact that William had said that he met up with Anthony. They'd essentially both been allowed to leave their embarkation airfields for D-Day to meet up.
Well, that's wild when you think about it. I mean, especially when you think of some of the accounts of guys that were permitted to leave, generally under armed guard, and mostly it's for medical purposes. They got to go to a hospital or something.
Yeah.
Um, to be
In
allowed to have a
hindsight,
furlough to go meet up with your brother right before the invasion of Europe.
yeah. I mean, in hindsight, looking back now, I think it was probably unlikely.
Yeah, and
Given,
I'm not casting dispersions on William's account of it. Again, you said it best. Memories fade, memories fail. And maybe it was a few weeks, maybe it was a couple weeks, but it seems unlikely that it would happen right before the invasion. But regardless, it's still amazing that they were able to link up and talk to each other.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, um, by all accounts, they were quite close. I mean, as I say, William was evidently in his life post-war the loss of his brother was very impactful on him, so they were obviously quite close. And so having the opportunity to do that, and like you say, the reality is that it was probably a few weeks before D-Day. I mean, again, we're lucky with the work we do on the troop carrier side of things, but we've had our hands on sort of wartime documents that go into an awful lot of detail about the security protocols around the troop carrier airfields prior to D-Day. And I just cannot imagine that, a first lieutenant and essentially, I think that, if I'm remembering rightly, Anthony was just a private going up
He
to their
was, yeah.
COs and saying, "Oh, my brother's just down the road. Is there any chance I can go and have a pint with him?" I find very slim. But what's the earlier sort of coincidences start around that sort of time, because even though Anthony was not deployed by Williams troop carrier group on D-Day, um, Williams troop carrier group did deploy 2 battalions of 507th. So if Anthony had not been headquarters company 1st Battalion, for example, if he'd been in the 2nd or 3rd Battalion headquarters company, he would have been on the same airfield as his brother. And who knows, he could even have jumped from the same aircraft that his brother flew. But
Yeah,
they were,
the I mean, I did not do a ton of research on this because I didn't want to steal your thunder with because this is a great presentation already. But from what I was able to ascertain, William dropped elements of Fox Company of the
that sounds right.
507th.
Yes, absolutely right. Yes,
So yeah,
because
you're right. I mean, it's just by a pure coincidence that he didn't end up dropping his brother or his brother's unit.
yeah, it could so easily have been organized in such a way. But as it was, when Anthony moved to his embarkation airfield, which was RAF Fullbeck, which was 7 or 8 miles to the north of Barkston Heath, where William was, so they're even closer at that point. The 1st Battalion of the regiment and the regimental headquarters elements were dropped by the 442nd Troop Carrier Group out of RAF Fullback. So they were very, very, very close by. So yeah, you've got these two brothers that are in different job roles, but essentially are trying to achieve the same thing, really, which is an airborne deployment of an airborne force, and so they're close together, and it just so happens, like I say, that fate brings them very close together when they're in England, but it brings them even closer together in Normandy, which is the mad side of the story. So if we start to look at how D-Day unfolded, the 507th was the last parachute regiment of the two American airborne divisions to be dropped on D-Day. So it was the final two serials in the troop carrier in the larger troop carrier formation to be dropped over Normandy on D-Day. And so German flak's obviously pretty intense. It's been more intense for some of the previous serials, and the best we can ascertain is that perhaps the German anti-aircraft gunners become a little bit more preoccupied by what's going on the ground by this point, but the flak is still pretty intense. And the 2nd and the 3rd Battalion are in the first of the two serials carrying the 507th, and the regimental headquarters in the 1st Battalion are the final serial right at the tail end Charlie of the entire formation. So
that's a great point. I want to foot stomp a little bit. It's kind of a free for all for the gunners at first, right? I mean, they've just got to contend with the planes, but now they've got paratroopers in the area, and these paratroopers are not sitting back. And now you've got to contend with possibly being attacked by these troops that are on the ground. I mean, you would think that there would be a lull in the fire a little bit as this happens, but considering especially where Anthony's drop takes place, there weren't. I would say that just from a quick look at German unit dispersal in the area, there weren't as many anti-aircraft guns in that neck of the woods where they come down. But
no, absolutely not.
obviously, when we get to William, that's a different story.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the big concerns from a troop carrier perspective were actually, when it came to flak, were more with the Channel Islands than they were, actually over the peninsula, because the Channel Islands were really, really heavily defended from a flak perspective. And of course, for those that aren't overly clued up, the two airborne divisions, the American airborne divisions, flew around to the west side of the peninsula and crossed over from the west.
Yeah, and they pivot around Jersey and Guernsey, so they've got to make that swing as they cut across the Cotentin.
Absolutely, yeah. So you've got William, and as you quite rightly said, he's flying an aircraft that's carrying members of Fox Company 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment. And I'm going to bring up the first. Well, first of all, what I'll do is I'll bring up a picture of just to remember what screen I'm looking at here. So
battling technology, it's no big deal.
always. So hopefully everyone can see the image. It's on the screen. For those that are listening, obviously, hopefully you get the opportunity to watch the sort of video of this podcast, and then you'll be able to see the image. So this is the aircraft. This is Hitztaler's aircraft, his C-47. Hitztaler is the man standing second from the left. So that's the man himself. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up is because we've got a full picture of the crew, and there's also a flight nurse there. A lot of the aircraft were assigned flight nurses. Obviously, in the case of this particular aircraft, because it was lost on D-Day, as we'll go into, they never flew the medical air evacuation missions on this aircraft, but the crews were trained prior to the invasion for medical air evacuation flights. And therefore you found that in a lot of cases a flight nurse was assigned to a crew, simply from the point of view of establishing a good sort of working partnership between the aircrew and the nurse. So that's Williams' aircraft, and I wanted to bring up this image because this is an image that was drawn by William of his flight over Normandy on D-Day, and it brings up several key points. So we can see on the left-hand side that as William's aircraft crosses over the western coast of the peninsula, that's when the aircraft is first hit by flak. And then, of course, it enters this infamous cloud bank, which we've spoken about before. And I've spoken about on various other podcasts with Paul Woodadge, that throws these troop carrier formations into something of a disarray, because it means that the formations of aircraft have got to fan out to avoid aerial collisions. And essentially, this is the reason why certain aircraft lose their bearing, to put it in the best way I can think to put it.
Yeah, most of them, they're flying using VFR, which is visual flight reference, with the lights on the aircraft.
Yeah,
And while they have been doing formation flying and practicing it extensively, once you hit that cloud bank, there's almost a little bit of a vertigo effect that happens, kind of throwing these guys into a little bit of a disarray. Now, many of them just stayed on their course and drilled through, but like you said, for precautionary measures, I believe the practice was that you would spread out. There was a set amount of room you would spread out, and
yeah,
then
absolutely.
reconvene on the flight lead once you exit whatever issue you have, in this case, clouds.
Yeah, absolutely right. It was almost the same process that that bomb squadrons would carry out in instances of heavy cloud cover. They would essentially create larger intervals between each aircraft to avoid the risk of them colliding in midair. And for the troop carrier guys, they know firsthand what the effects of two C-47s colliding in midair can be. Because for the 316th Troop Carrier Group, one of the groups that was part of the 52nd Wing alongside the 61st, during Exercise Eagle in May, two aircraft collide with the loss of all personnel on board, including a group commander, a squadron commander, and a company commander from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment is also lost. And the risk of that happening when you've got, I mean, obviously the loss of the personnel during Eagle was great, but there were only, I say only, two airborne observers on each aircraft. There wasn't a full stick of personnel on board each aircraft.
Hmm.
So it's easy to imagine what the loss would have been had two aircraft with 17, 18 men sticks of paratroopers on board would have been had they collided. So
Plus
they're very,
para packs, all their munitions,
absolutely, yeah.
catastrophic.
Yeah, absolutely. So of course they have to try and avoid the quite severe risk of aircraft colliding in midair. Thankfully, on D-Day, there's no evidence to suggest that it happened at all. There was no aircraft that collided in midair. The aircraft that were lost were all lost to flak or through mechanical malfunctions. But so there is some argument, obviously, that there is merit to fanning out the formation. But of course, you know, these guys weren't briefed that they were going to fly into a cloud bank. And had they known that it was going to be there, then there's reason to argue that the flight route would have been altered slightly, or that they could have climbed to an altitude above the cloud bank for a predefined period of time before then descending. But they were completely unaware that it was gonna hit them, and so they break the formation up. And of course, as you say, they're flying almost completely blind at that point. They lose all contact with the aircraft around them. Of course, as we know, the aircraft were ordered to maintain radio silence for a certain portion of the mission, so they're not really supposed to communicate with one another directly. And the reality is that aircraft got scattered, and while some deviated maybe a mile or two from course, others, you know, deviated quite some distance from course. And as it happens, there's one squadron, the 59th, who are part of the 61st Troop Carrier Group, Williams Group, that deviates very far off course and eventually drops personnel of the 3rd Battalion of the 3rd Battalion Headquarters Company, the 507th, at Grania, which is another story which many people will have heard of, and again, our friend Marty Morgan has covered in quite a bit of detail. So you see these huge variances between guys that, like you say, stuck to their guns and just thought, screw it, we're just going to keep on course, at speed, straight through the soup, and come out the other end of it and see what we get at the other side of it. Because of course they don't know how long they're going to be in the cloud for. They don't know how deep it is. They've just got to do whatever they can to try and survive it and get to the drop zones. One of the things that many people will recognize from this map is that the placement of the DZ and St. Mary Gleeson, those sorts of things, is ever so slightly sort of off to reality. But essentially what William was trying to emphasize was that he was hit by flak over the drop zone. And what happens to his aircraft is it suffers damage to its rudder, and it suffers damage to some of the other flight controls. And the aircraft is forced into a huge arcing bank to the left. So it takes the aircraft, he drops his paratroopers, but it takes the aircraft back out over the channel and then back in again over the peninsula. And it's at that point where he decides that he can no longer he stands no chance of regaining control of the aircraft, and essentially he orders the crew to bail out of the aircraft. Now, sadly, the aircraft does have 2 fatalities on board. The tech sergeant Orlo Montgomery, who was the aircraft's radio operator, he's hit by flak on board the aircraft fatally, and he dies essentially in his seat. And there's a paratrooper from F Company 507th, a guy called Private Charles Stout, who is also fatally wounded by flak whilst he's on board the aircraft.
Now, was this flak over the drop zone they were hit by, or was it when they re-entered over the peninsula?
To be honest with you, there's not really much specification as to when the wounds occurred, but in the case of Stout,
It would
I
have
would
had to
say
have been at the DZ, right?
absolutely, because he was left on board the aircraft, as was Orlo Montgomery. So when Hitztaler, when William gives the order to bail out of the aircraft, Orlo Montgomery, the radio operator, and Charles Stout are left on board the aircraft, and the remaining crew specify in the missing aircrew report that by the time they bail out of the aircraft, both men are dead. So there's no, as far as they were concerned, there wasn't any need to attempt to extract them from the aircraft or to help them out of the aircraft. And so they bail out the aircraft, and the aircraft loses control, and it crashes to in an area in the vicinity of a village called Negreville, which is to the north west of St. Mary Gleeson. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my window that I'm sharing to share quickly a map. So we've got Negreville in the center of screen. The aircraft actually came down along the banks of the River Douve, which is obviously a river that's got some links to the 82nd and the 101st.
Yep, sure does.
As it weaves its way south. But the Douve sort of flows through Negreville and then off sort of to the south, to the northeast. And the aircraft, can you see my pointer at all?
I can.
You can. Okay, so that's good. So the aircraft actually comes down at the end of this dirt track, just past the hamlet of Rouville. And as you can see, the Douve runs through this area.
Yeah, just west to it. Yep.
And when the weather's not great, this area it's not a floodplain quite like what you get at Lafayette, for example, but it does flood quite heavily. So, and the interesting thing is that there is a memorial at the crash site, which is right at the end of this dirt track. But it's signposted from the center of Negreville, and there is some information in the town square at Negreville about the crash site, but they're not overly specific on how to actually get to the memorial. So it's a bit of a nightmare. But hopefully anyone that's watching this video who fancies taking a look at the memorial, use this map. It's right at the end of a dirt track. Sections of it you'll probably have to walk down to get to it, but it is where the aircraft came down, which I believe is a good thing, because obviously you've got 2 fatalities there. So there's 2 bodies recovered from the aircraft at that spot. Now, as you can see, or as we could see from the map that William Hitztaler drew of his let's call it his saga on D-Day, he immediately lands by parachute again in the vicinity of Negreville, and he moves in the direction of this village here, the first word of which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, Iveto Bocage, possibly. And he finds himself in the care of a French farmer. But he's got no idea really where he is, and he's got no idea how he's going to find his way back to Allied lines. So he makes what is probably the correct decision, or we can say categorically now was the correct decision, which was basically just to hold up and wait for the Allies to liberate this portion of territory, essentially. Now, going back to Anthony. Anthony is now in the air himself, on board an aircraft of the 303rd Troop Carrier Squadron. Here he is.
And probably with a similar timeline to his brother.
He would have been essentially in the region of 6 or 7 minutes behind his brother. So that was roughly the intervals between the serials. So by all accounts, by the time Williams' aircraft has done this huge arc to the left and has come back over the peninsula, Anthony's on the ground. He will have jumped out of his aircraft. So this is a not brilliant picture of Anthony here on the screen, if you can see that.
Yep.
Now, Anthony is misdropped 4 or so kilometers to the northwest of his drop zone. And again, for those that are familiar with the actions of the 507th on D-Day, know that their drop zone was near the village of Amfreville, which is on the western side of the Murdere River, and is to the northwest of the Lafayette area.
Yeah, he comes down to the like southwest of Chef du Plon, somewhere in
Yes.
that area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he's sorry, no, he comes down northwest of that area.
Oh, okay.
So if I bring the map back up, we can have a quick overview of the areas in question. So we've got St. Mary-Glise here. We've got Lafayette here.
Oh, there's Amfreville. Okay.
The flooded Murdere. So there's Amfreville there. So the 507th DZ is roughly this area here.
Mm-hmm. And
where Anthony and his aircraft deploy is up here near the Hammervey. So they land by parachute in the area of Hammervey, and essentially the stick breaks up into 2 portions. One side of the stick decides to head off and kind of do its own thing. The other side of it decides that the best case scenario for them is to hole up in a small patch of woods and to wait for dawn, essentially, so that they can try and get their bearings and figure out what they're going to do before moving out towards their drop zone or their objective. And around about 8 a.m. on the morning of D-Day, their position is discovered by a German patrol, and a firefight breaks out. And by all accounts, it's quite an intense firefight. There's a lot of ammunition shared between the 2 sides, and eventually the American forces realize that they're outnumbered, or they run low on ammunition, and they're rounded up. So Anthony is one of 4 guys that are rounded up and then marched to the Chateau de Hammerve, which is a German headquarters building. And for a period of the morning, they are interrogated, and by all accounts, quite physically interrogated, to try and get whatever information about their regimental objectives or whatever it might be. The Germans reach a point where they decide ultimately that they have got whatever information that they're going to get out of these four guys, and they disarm them of all of their belongings, all of their equipment. Obviously, they'll have long been disarmed of any weaponry, and then marched back to the patch of woods where the firefight took place at 8 a.m. on the morning of D-Day, and they're executed. And it's actually witnessed by a French farmer witnesses the four men being marched back to the spot where they were originally captured, and he hears the gunfire when they are executed. And shortly thereafter, several local French civilians head to the patch of woods, and they find not only the four men that have been executed, but they find three others that were beaten to death at the end of this engagement on the morning of D-Day. So there's 7 men in total that are found in this patch of woods, all members of the 1st Battalion Headquarters Company 507th, who were then recovered by the French and buried in the churchyard at Hammerve.
Right now, they're later repatriated by Americans, correct? And there's video footage of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I was going to mention Marty Morgan did a really, really good video. So again, for anyone listening, if you go to Marty's YouTube channel, which I'm just going to stop sharing just temporarily so I can just remind myself what his YouTube channel is. So
You don't have to worry. We'll take care of that. We'll post all the links
okay.
with the episode description. So
Okay.
I know there's a good article from Marty as well. I'll post that with a bunch of other stuff. But please, sorry to interrupt on that.
Yeah, no problem at all. So the bodies are as I say recovered, and they're buried in the local civilian churchyard at Hammerve. And but what's most amazing about this, and this is where this coincidence comes in, is that whilst Anthony is on the ground, still alive, and whilst William is on the ground, having parachuted from his C-47, they're 3.5 miles away from each other, and they just don't know it. And whilst obviously we know that neither has got any control over the other's fate, they're not going to have been able to influence the outcomes of each other's fates in the slightest. The fact that these brothers were so close to each other on the ground, having both jumped from an aircraft, one obviously willingly, one of us obviously not quite so willingly, on the morning of D-Day. And because of the situation with Williams' aircraft being shot down in this, as I say, this big arcing left-hand turn, there's every chance that Anthony saw his brother's aircraft go down. There's a chance that, given the close proximity that the two are together, that he'll have potentially seen a flaming C-47 go down very close by, and of course would have had no idea that the crew members that are jumping from that aircraft were, one of them was his brother.
Yeah, what's really amazing is if the rudder doesn't get hit and they don't go into that arcing turn, let's just say it takes damage to the point where it's going to go down anyway, but that specific piece of equipment on that aircraft, the rudder, which helps, the steering, the left and right slides as an aircraft, you make those adjustments with it. I mean, if the rudder doesn't get damaged, it doesn't do that big arc, and it doesn't put them within, what would you say, 3.5 clicks of each other?
Yeah.
It's pretty amazing that all happened and put them in such close proximity, yet they're on the ground. They have no idea they're within that close a range of each other.
Yeah, it's mad because you want to jump back into history and say guys, you're right there, you're right next to each other, go and find each other, and everything will be okay. But of course, we know the tragic circumstances behind Anthony's death, and as you said, the exhumation of the remains is incredibly well documented. They were, because the local, so it was the 17th of June before that area was liberated by 7th Corps US Army, and at that point the first thing that the French civilians that had helped to bury the bodies did was turn the dog tags and the personal equipment of any of the men that they found over to the American forces. And obviously there's an immediate recognition that a war crime has taken place, and therefore 5 days after that there's an investigation launched, and the 165th Signal Photographic Company, there's two men from that company that are tasked with documenting the whole thing. So whilst it's an incredibly difficult thing to watch, particularly the sections of the footage that show the exhumations of the bodies, which have obviously been by that point in the ground for 10 days or so, longer, whilst they're difficult to watch, it's an incredible insight into the lengths that the US Army went to not just go, oh, these guys were killed in a war, these things happen, to fully investigate the circumstances behind how they'd been killed. And it was to the point where, and again, it was all documented in the footage, they were taken to the patch of woods where these guys were executed, and bullet casings and pieces of equipment were found, and they were able to mark almost man for man the spots where these men fell. So, as I say, it's a great insight into the lengths that they went to investigate this. The other interesting thing is as well that when they exhumed the bodies, there was actually an eighth man, a member of Charlie Company, 507th, who had been lost in the general area as well, was also buried with these 7 guys that fell victim to the Germans in Hemmerway. So
now there's a memorial there to them, is there not?
there is, yes. So there's a memorial in the churchyard. And the other interesting thing as well is that if anyone's particularly interested in going, or anyone's going to Normandy, Anthony does still remain buried at the American Cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. So he's somebody that you can go and visit.
And conceivably go and visit the churchyard, and then go visit the crash site as well, if you
yes,
want to connect the dots of the brothers. It's pretty amazing that that's all there, if anyone's interested in going and
yeah.
visiting. It's all well documented and well memorialized. It's pretty amazing.
And it's one of these stories as well where it feels like a very small story, and in the grand scheme of things, it is a very small story. But you could easily spend a day looking at these sites alone. You know, you could easily spend a day in Normandy just looking at this story and the circumstances behind it all. Yeah, I've always found it, absolutely mind blowing. And of course, William's saga doesn't end when he parachutes out the aircraft either. He's got a
No, he has
situation.
to evade until he can be repatriated as well.
Absolutely. So he's in the same boat as, because obviously they're in such close proximity. Again, it's around about 17th, 18th of June that the area where he's holed himself up is liberated by American forces. So he turns himself over to an infantry unit that's moving through the area, and he's sat in the back of a Jeep and driven off to an advanced landing ground in just on the outskirts of St. Mary Glees. And from there, he radios back to his airfield at Barkston Heath. And of course, the other crew members have already got back to Barkston Heath. So the other crew members have somehow managed to evade the Germans, get back to American lines, and get back to Barkston Heath, but they don't know what's happened to William. They've got no idea whether he's
Yeah,
alive, whether he's dead.
for all they know, he's dead.
Absolutely. So, and whether it was the case or not, it's very likely it was the case. But as the captain of the aircraft, as the pilot of the aircraft, he most likely was the last man out the door.
Yep.
So they had no idea that he was still alive. So there's this amazing story in the 61st Troop Carrier Group War Diary of them receiving the news that William is alive, and there's this sort of wave of guys being gobsmacked that he's still alive going across the base, and his actual squadron commander, a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Frederick, is actually the guy that flies the C-47 that flies over to Normandy to pick him up, because, as Frederick said, I had to see with my own eyes that it was actually him and that he was alive.
It's got to be like somebody coming back from the dead almost, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a crazy story, but the really sad part is this oral memory from William that, as I say, Marty provided to me. He refers to his brother in that as a member of the 101st Airborne Division
Hmm.
who'd been killed in combat. So it begs the question, was William ever aware of the exact circumstances behind how his brother was killed?
Yeah, they might have shielded him from that.
Yeah, I can imagine there might very well have been an element of that. Yeah,
Especially because the troop carrier pilots were so important to the war effort, and something like that would affect them to the point where they might have to ship them to the ZOI, and that might not be what they wanted to do. Maybe they just wanted to spare him of it so they could keep him flying.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And obviously, you've got, like you alluded to, the impact of morale on these guys, and the psychological impact of losing a brother that, as we said earlier, he was obviously very close to. Would have been, sadly, we don't even know when he learned that his brother was dead. But it certainly seems like he never had any idea of exactly the circumstances behind how Anthony was killed.
And you intimated it earlier in the episode that it might have been part of his grief coping. He was repressing the information or suppressing the information in
Yeah,
his memories. So when he finally did his oral history interview, to him, he was telling you what he thought was the truth, telling the interviewer what he thought was the truth.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah. And it's just I find it a very tragic story, but it's just these sort of the number of coincidences that very nearly on several occasions brings these brothers together, and then ultimately on D-Day they're separated forever. And yeah, I find it very sad.
I think the stories like this are the kind that are why researchers and historians like ourselves keep digging and keep digging with, and that's why it's such a captivating story. Um, the entire Normandy invasion and the rest of and the World War itself. There are so many stories like this, not necessarily a familial connection between them, but these very intimate, um, finite, granular stories that exist across the battle spaces that keeps the folks that are interested in the history of World War II digging and digging and digging and uh, I think it's amazing that we're still unearthing stories like this to this day. Um,
Absolutely. I mean, I do still find, the sheer number of guys that were lost during, of soldiers of all nations, and that were lost during the war, mind blowing to consider. And it's very easy to, I mean, even with a unit as small as a company of men, to look at them almost as numbers, but you know each an individual person, each with their own individual story, um, and you could realistically probably write a book about each one of them if you had that information available. And so, looking into situations like this with with the Hitztaler brothers, and really delving into the circumstances behind, particularly, like to say, the loss of Anthony and William's war as well. It's fascinating.
yeah, I'd say that especially now with the accessibility of information, uh, there's so many more of these stories that just pop up in everybody's work that you see. I'll tell for this example, I'll use like Peter Caddick Adams, and Peter's a very engaging writer, um, and I love his books. But he's got all of these smaller stories intertwined in the larger story, and that's what makes it so engaging. There are many historians that write in that vein. I'm just using Peter as an example, but uh, to me, that's what keeps people coming back to the story of World War II. And this was great. I really appreciate you telling the story. But I mean, to put a bow on it, though, William doesn't, if my memory serves, he continues service, does he not?
He did, yeah. He flew in Korea, and as I understand, he actually retired during the Vietnam War. So he was
As a,
still flying with the Air Force as late as Vietnam.
yeah, so I mean, obviously it was something he loved to do. He stays in the service past World War II, and then, like you said, continues to fly through multiple conflicts.
He
Pretty
actually,
amazing. Despite all the hurt and all the damage to him personally,
yeah,
emotionally, he still manages to maintain his sense of duty.
absolutely, yeah. And he actually remained, he actually remained in aviation until he retired from his civilian job. I can't remember his exact role, but I know that he worked for an airline, something to do with aircraft safety or aircraft maintenance. So like you say, it was obviously a love that he had, a passion that he had. And again, you have to wonder whether or not, without the outbreak of a war, would William have ever considered flying an aircraft for a living? It's but yeah,
It's a lot to contemplate. All the little twists and turns in this story, the left versus the right, the yin to the yang, with these things that happened. Um, Pretty amazing that it's such subtle things sometimes that influence things greatly. Like you said, that first burst of machine gun fire, and then the clouds on his aircraft, and then making his way to the drop zone, and then they're hit again. I mean, and the rudder being hit causes this huge change of events
yeah.
for him personally. Um, Thanks for coming on and bringing this to the audience. I think it's a fantastic story. And if anybody wants to research it further or read about it further, it's in one of your books.
Yeah, so William's story is in volume 1 of our breathtaking spectacle troop carrier history.
And even though we're going to put the links in this show description, where can we find that?
So it's now published by Flying Pencil, which is based in Holland, but they do have, or we're hoping to have, US distribution. So anyone from that's listening from the States should be able to buy a copy that won't get flown over the Atlantic sometime soon.
But we'll put the links in there. Do you have anything coming up next? Any speaking engagements? Or are you working on any more projects?
Well, we're working on volume 3 of the book series, so we're on to the final troop carrier wing now. We released volume 2 earlier. Was it this year or last year? Can't remember now. Back end of last year, early this year, can't remember. We're on to the 50th troop carrier wing. So if there's any Band of Brothers fans listening, which I know there will be,
Of course.
given it's we'll be focusing on that book will focus on the 439th, who obviously flew Easy Company on D-Day. So we'll be getting more into sort of that sort of side of 101st territory in volume 3. I've started a memorial project here in the UK with a friend to build 3 memorials next year, to coincide with the 82nd anniversary of the 82nd Airborne Division being in the UK, in 3 different locations for members of the 82nd that died in England. Basically, they weren't on in combat when they were killed, and obviously because they weren't killed in combat, their names are not in history books. They're not on memorials in Normandy or whatever. So we want to try and change that. We want to get their names on a memorial, and so we're doing that at 3 locations. And aside from that, I've got a couple of talking dates coming up, but nothing to
Well, what we'll do
to
is if anybody wants to follow along on your socials, I'm sure you'll be putting out informations about those memorials and your speaking dates. That sound about right?
Yeah, no problem.
Fantastic. Adam, thanks again for coming on and doing this. It's always great to have you on, pal.
No, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, take care.